Okay, so I admit it. This won't be the first shrinking stump creation video on the internet, and it probably won't be the last, but hopefully it will be my first and my last. Not everything I do is aluminum, the vast majority of it is, but some of it was steel, and unfortunately, in a few instances, the 16 gauge steel proved to be a little tougher than the soft pine shrinking stump. It's starting to develop a few gouges and splits and stuff like that. The last time that I was using the reg for Dragon Con had a few little issues, and I decided that it was time to redo the shrinking stump.
And one of the things that we did before we left for Dragon Con was commission a tree company to come in and cut down a few trees in preparation for this year's hurricane season. One of the trees that they cut down was this sweet gum that was just a little too close to the house for our comfort. I basically just had them drop the tree and leave it where it was laying, and they were nice enough to cut it into sections. And so I'm going to use one of these sections.
Much to my unpleasant surprise, I discovered my handcart had a flat tire today, so couldn't use that and kick this stupid stump all the way around to the front yard. First world problems, right? Here we are. This is my new, soon-to-be hardwood shrinking stump. Dimensionally, it's pretty close to the same size as the other one. It's a little narrower in the narrowest area, and obviously, as you saw, it's a little taller. Hopefully that'll work out. So, if you've watched any of my other videos, you know I'll be the first person to admit that I don't really have any idea what I'm doing at all. Not a clue. I just sort of make it up as I go along. But what I do know is the previous shrinking stump that I was using, for the most part, worked out pretty well. So I am going to recreate the bowl dimensions that I used on that one. And I used a circular saw to cut it, and then a angle grinder to clean it out. So that's what I'm going to do in this one as well. First thing I'm going to do, take some measurements.
I don't really have a basis for comparison, but the pine one that I made worked out pretty well. So my intent was to replicate the bowl depth and width that I used on the other one. So I took a couple measurements, and then I set my saw to be just a little shallower than the depth that I wanted, and then marked the center point on the blade guard to give me an idea of about how I wanted to line everything up. Laid a Ford F-250 brake drum on the stump and used that as a guide. It was a little shorter, but close enough. And from there, I just started making a series of cuts. After I had made a couple and I had a pretty good feel for where the front of the blade guard needed to sit, I took a stop after I had cut one of them and marked that to give me a couple more reference points. So I'm fairly certain this isn't how circular saws were designed to be used. I'm also fairly certain this isn't a good or safe idea, but I did it anyways. Once I had a fairly aggressive star pattern formed in the thing, I made a series of shallow cuts extending from the edge of the circle into the middle. Just basically guidelines for the depth of the die grinder when I started grinding. Once I had it all cut up, I used a 36 grit flat disc and the 4.5-inch angle grinder to get started on the profiling, rounding, and shaping of the dish. Respirator and safety glasses, very, very important. This is an incredibly messy job, and you will be breathing sawdust for some time. All said and done, I think this project took me about an hour and a half to 2 hours to do. Once I had the thing largely profile sanded, I took the 36, or by now it was an 80 grit, flap disc off and used one of the other flap discs that I save from other projects that's pretty much worn down, too worn down for any sort of aggressive profiling, but it works great for cleaning up and polishing and stuff like that. By now, it's probably the equivalent of like a 120 or so grit flat disc. And I then used that to clean up the interior of the bowl, and once I had the inside done, nice and smooth, made a couple passes around the outside. And from there, it was 80 grit with the pneumatic angle grinder, and I just went through and took out all the little, you can see the little line divots. That's where I got a little too aggressive with the flat disc, but most of those are fairly shallow, and 80 grit on the angle grinder, on the pneumatic angle grinder, was able to take those off. Once I had that done, the same thing, made a few passes just to smooth it all down and make it look pretty. And then a couple minutes with some scrap sandpaper.
Isn't it pretty? Other than this one little split right here where I was practicing on how not to use a circular saw safely or correctly, it came out pretty well. I've got a nice dish here that I will be able to do the same thing that I've done. I've got one side that's a little steeper than the other sides, which is what I did on the other one. So when I want to make a little more aggressive tucks, I don't know if that really works or not, but it certainly feels to me like it does. So that's how I set this one up as well. I've got a nice big flat surface here to pound on. This one weighs a lot more than the other one did. I may actually end up having to build a rolling stand for this thing, use some heavy duty casters, because moving this one out of the way is a much bigger task than moving this small dried pine out of the way. I am going to put a couple or a metal band around the outside that I can put rings and stuff like that to hang the hammers and tools that I use while I'm working on this. It is sweet gum, so hopefully when it dries out it will not do the things that sweet gum does. We'll see. Have a great day.